So Goldman presents once more a summary of the three things she regards as pernicious influences. First, religion, which she regards as having fettered, bound, trapped the human mind. Property, which she defines here as the monopoly of things. She sees it as having subdued and stifled human needs. And finally, the state, which she regards as having enslaved the spirit of humanity, dictating every phase of conduct. So now she turns to her in-depth criticism of government, citing other American anarchists. For example, Emerson asserted that all government, in essence, is tyranny. Why? Well, the view is that governments aim at the absolute subordination of the individual. Now that, of course, is a matter of debate. Is it true that all governments aimed at this absolute subordination, or is this more of a hyperbole or even a straw man attack? Now, a case in terms of supporting this can be made that if you look at governments, the laws are constantly expanding, and if you look at legislative bodies, they're constantly passing laws. Every year, every month, more and more laws that restrict. And so you could make a case that governments do constantly try to expand. Interestingly enough, although anarchists are usually cast as being on the far left, people on the right, certain conservatives, libertarians most especially, they often assert that government should be kept small and at least make the case that smaller government is better. But of course, it's also the case that the far right, the fascists, do believe this. As we saw when we were talking about Mussolini, one definitive quality of fascism is that the individual is absolutely subordinated to the state. And so, in terms of the fascists, the anarchists are quite right. She then turns to our good dead friend Henry David Thoreau, an American anarchist. He's a guy, once again, that seems to have initially developed the concept of civil disobedience, although he wasn't particularly successful at it in his efforts. And he asserted that law never made man more just, and respect for it makes even the well-disposed agents of injustice. Now, when Thoreau wrote his essay on civil disobedience, two of his main motivating factors were the war against Mexico, which he regarded as unjust, and the Fugitive Slave Act, which he regarded as unjust, in that respecting that law and following that law would make someone unjust. So, according to Goldman, the keynote of government is injustice. Part of her criticism is that governments punish insignificant offenses. Again, this is an empirical question. Also does include some value judgment of what's considered insignificant or not. But if you look at, for example, historical examples like the war on drugs, how, say, policing operates, etc., you could make a case that governments do overpunish, which is one of the debates we're having today as this is being recorded. And she claims that governments maintain themselves by the greatest offense, which is, for her, annihilation of individual liberty. She then turns to another thinker, Uda, whose name I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, speaking on the state. According to this fellow anarchist, the state aims only to instill qualities in its public by which its demands are obeyed and its treasury filled. The highest attainment of the state is reducing humans to clockwork, and that it destroys all finer and delicate liberties. And it's asserted that the state just requires these things. First, a tax-paying machine without a hitch, and exchequer without deficit, basically public money, or state money, and a public, monotonous, obedient, colorless, spiritless, moving like sheep between two walls. And perhaps he wasn't the originator of the notion of casting people following the obedience of the state like sheep, probably not, but he does make use of that metaphor. So, is Uda right about this? Well, interestingly, of course, the state does require money, but the tax paying is often seen as something that, at least on the right, should be avoided, at least for for certain people. And of course, operating without a deficit in the time when Goldman was gold manning was probably something they did aim for. But of course, today, at least in the United States, massive deaths are accepted. And the view of, essentially having the public obedient, and monotonous, well, you could make the case that this is what the state aims for. Clearly, totalitarian states, very oppressive states, push for that. And the anarchists are not just, criticizing the United States. They criticize all governments. And you could look at, for example, the claims of various politicians today in response to the protest, that what they're looking for is obedience, people simply obeying. So those are some of the anarchist criticisms of the state. Goldman then turns to Bakunin, whose name again I'm probably horribly mispronouncing, speaking on the state. So, according to this thinker, the state is seen as synonymous with the surrender of the liberty of the individual and small minorities, the destruction of social relationship, the curtailment or complete denial of life for its own aggrandizement. And according to Goldman, most modern thinkers agree that government is necessary only to maintain or protect property and monopoly. And this is a common criticism that you see from critics on the left, that the function of the state is primarily not to protect the citizens, their rights, but to protect property and monopoly, that companies own, have a sort of exclusive control over things. And again, this can be looked at as an empirical question. You can look through the various laws and policies and procedures to see what is the focus in terms of what the state aims at doing. Goldman then turns to a topic that is always relevant, but is especially relevant today, that of law and order. So what she turns to now is the arguments that people give in defense of government, saying that this is why either we need government or why government is sort of, natural and necessary. So she considers essentially four main reasons advanced in defense of government. The first is that it's claimed that the state rests on natural laws. Secondly, and this is part of the law and order response, is that it maintains social order and harmony. Third is the matter of law enforcement, that the state diminishes crime. And fourthly, that the state is supposed to prevent the lazy from fleecing his fellows. So she turns to replying to each of these defenses of the state. So let us begin with natural law. So according to Goldman, she defines natural law, this is how she defines it. It's a factor in humans, asserted freely, spontaneously, and without external force, in harmony with nature's requirements. Its expression does not need the machinery of government, the club, gun, handcuff, or prison. So her assertion is that she, in a way, redefines natural law, and saying that essentially it is, well, exactly what it seems to say, namely it's a law that's natural. And her assertion is that if the state really was founded on natural law, it wouldn't need machinery of government, clubs, guns, handcuffs, or prisons, to maintain the state. Because obeying such laws would simply require, opportunity to do so. Because if it is truly natural law, people would just do it without being compelled. So use an analogy, but you could use an analogy to like getting hungry and wanting to eat food. People do not have to be clubbed or threatened with guns or prison to get them to eat food. And so if states rest on natural laws, kind of a reasoning seems to be, they would not need the machinery of the state to force people to follow these natural laws. So she asserts that governments show that they don't maintain themselves by such harmonious factors by the violence, force, and coercion they use. And Blackstone, another thinker, asserted that human laws are invalid because they are contrary to the laws of nature. So in response to the natural law argument, Goldman essentially asserts that, well, if they truly were natural laws, we wouldn't need this machinery of punishment and enforcement to, keep order in the state. And then Goldman moves on to order. So, one of the stock defenses for having governments with, police forces and using force against citizens is order, maintaining order. And this is a favorite, at least half of the favorite of certain politicians. Now, the anarchist counter, at least Goldman's, is this. She claims you really can't ascribe to governments any capacity for order or social harmony. Why? Well, she asserts that order that arises from submission to, power, the violence. Now, what she asserts is something that, many critics would claim is unrealistic, but she claims that true social harmony grows naturally out of solidarity of interests. And in a society where workers have nothing, while those who never work enjoy everything, solidarity of interests is non-existent. Hence, she asserts, social harmony is a myth. And this is, something, if you're familiar again with left criticisms of the political, order and capitalist order, that's a fairly standard assertion, namely that workers have, nothing, and those who, don't actually do the work, own everything, that is regarded as a problem. Her further criticism is that the government responds, to this problem by giving ever greater privileges to those monopolizing the earth and further enslaving the disinherited masses. So assertion, again, is something you commonly hear from the left, and the further left, the more the criticisms, that there's a small, group that keeps getting more and more and more, and the many keep getting less and less. And again, this is an empirical question. You can look at how the resources, the wealth, the income is divided up and see how that's distributed. And looked at objectively, we talk about, the 1%, and of course even the smaller percentages having, vast amounts of wealth compared to the majority, which have just a fraction. So this is, again, a standard criticism from the left. So how do they maintain this order? Well, according to Goldman, the arsenal of the government is law, police, soldiers, courts, legislatures, and prisons that essentially, compels people to serve this order. Now, connecting it to the protests of today, and also we can go back to like Occupy Wall Street and throughout history, the assertion here is that the few are benefiting from a system designed to benefit them, the many are not, and in order to maintain this order, the police, the courts, and soldiers are used to keep any dissension in check, to crush it. And if we can look at the protest occurring today, laying aside ideological concerns, just looking at it, objectively what is occurring, we can see protesters that went out talking about Second Amendment rights and complaining about the lockdown. They were not stopped by the police. And then we can look at people who are protesting police violence and police brutality. They are, even when they're not engaged just, in violence, we could, of course, have another debate about the, looting and so forth. But peaceful protesters were met with violence in many cases. And this would be right along the, Goldman's analysis. If she was around today, she would say, look, you see the police firing rubber bullets at those protesters who did nothing but stand there, see them tear gassing people to clear them out so the president can go and have a photo op. She would say, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Now, people, of course, can counter this, because again, the argument given by people who defend the state is that you need the state to maintain order or you'll have chaos. And what they would tend to point to is they would focus, narrowly focus on the looting and property damage and say, that's what we need the state to crush those people. Continuing along with law and order, another argument advanced in defense of the state, which Goldman addresses, is the argument that the state diminishes crime, essentially explicit, use of the police to reduce crime. So what's her counter here? Well, her counter is this. She asserts that the state is the greatest criminal. So you could take pretty much any crime that the state, almost any crime the state punishes, and you could point out to the state doing that, on a vast scale. For example, stealing through taxes. And interestingly, the anarchists take a view similar in many respects here to the Tea Party. The Tea Party was, taxed enough already, also a clever play on, the American Revolution, Boston Tea Party, etc. And so the notion that the state is stealing people's money through taxes is something that the anarchists, at least Goldman-style anarchists, believe, as well as, certain conservatives. Where they kind of part company, though, is most likely in the next aspects. The anarchists regard the state as a criminal because it engages in murder, large-scale murder in the form of war and capital punishment. So theft and murder, which are considered, crimes, are committed on a massive scale by the state. And again, if you look at it just sort of objectively, historically, states do take through taxes, they take through conquest, and if you took every murderer in history, non-state murderer in history, and added up their total, that would be horrifying. But if you took all the numbers of people killed by states and added that up, that would be just massively overwhelming, just millions upon millions of people. And so the anarchists do have a decent case here. Now, she also points out that if we take the idea that the state is supposed to diminish crime, it has failed to do this, because all its efforts to really go after what is claimed to be crime have yet to address this. And again, this is a matter for considerable reasonable debate, like why is that occurring? And one common argument is the one Goldman advances, is that it's not really trying to stop crime. It's essentially trying to maintain order by oppressing people, and so it's not going to fix problems. So what is the anarchist's view of crime? At least Goldman's view. Well, what she claims is this. She claims, and this is commonly claimed on the left, that people turn to crime, and it's a form of misdirected energy. And so what happens, she claims, is that institutions are directing people to the wrong channels. Why? Well, what she claims is this. While most people do what they hate and live a life they loathe, crime will be inevitable, and laws will only increase it. And again, this is often a claim made on the left that, why do people do crimes? Well, it's not because people want to do crimes. It's not that's their first choice. It's that they're in a situation in which they are pushed into crime. Now, this is a matter of considerable debate. Again, people on the left often present this line of reasoning, and conservatives on the right generally, reject that idea. And they often, attack it sarcastically and mocking it on the idea that, society would do this. But it is a matter of important discussion where crime originates. Then Goldman finishes up with the laziness part. The idea of that, that you need the state to protect people from the lazy. This could be like con artists, etc. And this is something you see sometimes on Fox News. One of the segments that occasionally gets aired is about someone who's on welfare or food stamps who manages to be getting this free stuff. And so that is that the criticism is that the state should not be allowing that. Now, Goldman kind of flips this around. She says that if society were free of the cost of keeping and protecting a lazy class, namely, she says, the upper, super wealthy classes, there'd be abundance for all. And laziness results from special privileges. And she gets kind of harsh by saying physical and mental abnormalities, kind of an ad hominem attack on the upper classes. But she claims that the present system fosters both. And she says it's amazing that people want to work at all. So, in terms of the state protecting people from laziness, she claims as a response that first, there is a lazy class that is doing the fleecing and protected by the state, and she thinks the present system is terrible, that it's amazing that people want to do anything at all. So she's highly critical of the state and responds to those four primary arguments in defense of the state.